It's great to see all of you here. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're all staying safe, healthy, all of that stuff. Wear your masks. You don't need to hear it from me. Anyway, so I figured before we jump into this event with Ibrahim, which is going to be fascinating, by the way, I'm very excited, and I hope all of you are too. I figured we would just kind of chat for like 15 minutes or so, and I'll get us started. It can just be a very casual conversation. We can share each other's experiences thus far, like on campus, what we've seen going on in terms of anti-Semitism and the Israel-related scene. I don't need to tell all of you guys that anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism has not let up since all of the coronavirus craziness affected all of us. There are a few issues that really stand out as being especially egregious, which I have written down here because I don't want to forget them, but I figure I'll just kind of touch on them really quickly and update you guys on what's going on these campuses in case you haven't heard. So I don't know if you guys heard about something that just happened at Cornell recently, where, if I'm not mistaken, there was a guest lecturer who was speaking with part of a program that the architecture school was running, I think. And the speaker was talking about the history of pre-state Israel, I guess, which would have been British, either run by the Ottoman Empire or British Mandate Palestine as administered by the League of Nations. And this presenter was showing pictures of Jewish immigrants to that land, early Jewish immigrants, but all of the pictures were blacked out. The pictures of the Jews were completely blacked out, entirely erased. Crazy. Like this lecturer is erasing Jewish presence in the land, literally, which is really crazy because that's kind of the epitome of the anti-Semitism behind this, right? It's disconnecting Jews from their connection with the land of Israel. So that's one crazy issue. We saw more insanity at Butler recently when the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion branch of the student government co-sponsored a protesting 101 event or something like that, which involved all sorts of artwork, except really it's just propaganda, demonizing Israel, calling it apartheid state, depicting Israeli soldiers purposely killing civilians and donning the logo Free Palestine, which you all know means erasing Israel. So it's ironic because you have this branch of student leadership that's supposed to foster diversity and inclusion, but it necessarily alienates and delegitimizes an entire nation of 8 million plus people. These are just two examples. I could go on, and there are more, especially at San Francisco State, where literally former terrorists and people who are still members of a terrorist organization are glorified. I'm sure you've all been keeping up with that issue. We can talk about that more if you guys have any questions. But one thing that I think is important to mention is that when we see this form of hatred on campus, the reactions from university administrators, people in power at the universities is much different than how they condemn other forms of hatred. When it comes to other forms of hatred and bigotry, they are condemned strongly by university administrations, administrators, presidents, talk about how this is unacceptable in our world and we need to fight it with all of our might, and that's great, and we should. But when it comes to this form of hatred of Israel, Zionists, Jews that support Israel, what have you, it's sort of brushed off as another point of view that we can debate, which is fine. I'm all for free speech, but it's not. It is not enforced equally, in my opinion. So yeah, that's a little bit of my rant on Sunday morning. Brief, touching on briefly things that we're seeing on campus. So if you guys want to jump in, share your thoughts, maybe share things that you've observed on your campuses for a few minutes before we start our discussion with Ibrahim. We would all love to hear from you guys. Feel free to just unmute your microphone and jump in. Don't be shy.
Hi, yes, I'm gonna jump on the gun with that. Yesterday, I actually recently attended an SJP meeting. Douglas Sandoval mentioned it to me. He wanted me to attend to kind of, see what the SJP's narrative was on UF's campus. And they had this Palestinian woman based in Ramallah who is a part of Al-Haq, which is the human rights organization. And she went on to talk about arbitrary detention and detention of Palestinians based on secret evidence. And she was basically saying that, like, at least with her house was raided 20 times by the IDF, and she said that all because her parents did nothing, and that her father was in non-consecutive detention for about 11 years because he did nothing. And the whole point of her story in all of this was that the IDF goes into, for example, Zone A of the West Bank, and will detain people without telling them why. And she called it illegal and against human rights. And that was kind of the whole premise of the meeting, was discrimination and detention. And this was the first time of me hearing this. And then also, as someone who aspires to be a journalist in the future, it seems fishy that, the IDF would go in for no reason, and have her father detained for 11 years for no reason. So it was really interesting. And then also her rhetoric was referring to Israel as the occupying government, as the occupying military force and all of that. So that's something that I, experienced recently. It was quite interesting.
Yeah, definitely. It's funny because whenever people are sharing personal narratives, you can't really argue with personal narratives. You can't tell someone, no, you're lying about your own experience. That didn't happen. But I think your approach to it is pretty spot on. When you should approach everything with a critical eye, be skeptical, see if there are any other ways that you can confirm the stories that you're hearing, and yeah, just on a general note, you're 100% correct that Israel doesn't just arrest people for no reason. People kind of throw around the meme of political prisoners, but more often than not, people who are arrested by Israel have a reason to be arrested. Either they've engaged in direct terrorist activity, or they're members of terrorist organizations, or providing support to terrorist organizations. So yeah. In general, you're right. Israel doesn't just arrest people for no reason, at least not that I know of. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. We see a lot of that on campuses. If we have a few more minutes here, if anyone else wants to jump in and share something. Euler?
Sorry, I guess I could go.
Yeah, go for it.
My mom's talking in the next room. If that's too distracting, I can go.
No, it's totally fine. My dog might start barking at some point. She's been known to do that, so it's cool.
But
go for it.
Not so much so like we've had an instance, which luckily, we've had like little things here and there, but not like really big things that should be like, at least that I'm aware of. But I do think, especially ever since we've been listening more to these webinars and things like that, I definitely have been like more alert. And I think, for example, in a class recently, it was about world geography, and we were about to talk about Israel, and I, just in the sense of like North Africa, Southwest Asia, things like that. And I definitely found myself a little bit more alert in the sense of making sure like nothing she said was bad almost, or that just wasn't true. Luckily she did, say all good things, and it wasn't really anything badly, but I definitely just wanted to kind of bring up that difference that I don't know if anyone else has noticed, but it's definitely something that has kind of changed my view.
Yeah, absolutely. If anyone else wants to go off of that, floor is still open. There are no wrong answers. Okay, yeah, cool. Yeah, this is all great. Thank you guys for sharing what you're seeing. Obviously, I love talking about this stuff. I do this stuff for a living. I could talk about it all day, every day. So if you guys, I know we only had a few minutes here, but if you guys want to talk through anything you see on campus, something's happening relating to Israel and you don't know what to think about it, or you want to talk through the problems, kind of develop your own thoughts, feel free to reach out to me and anyone else on the campus team at any time. We are happy to talk through these things with you and to help you make sense of them. That's what we're here for. We love doing this stuff. So without further ado, I will introduce our main speaker for this wonderful event, who is Ibrahim Abu Ahmad. And we're going to be talking about events beyond Israel's northern border. On college campuses, we see a lot of people talking about to the events very zoomed in between the river and the sea, the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And certainly that makes sense because it is a hot button geopolitical issue, to say the least. That's probably the understatement of the century, but it's also important to zoom out, which we don't see on campuses very much because there are other players involved. There's Iran, there's Hezbollah, which is a proxy of Iran. The Middle East is a very dynamic place, and it's important to zoom out a little bit, and that's what we're going to do with this event. Hopefully that's a goal we can accomplish. So Ibrahim Abu Ahmad, he is an Israeli Arab. He was born and raised in Nazareth, Israel, and now he lives in Haifa. He is a senior researcher, lecturer, and content editor at the Alma Research and Education Center located in Tefan. Ibrahim's main research concerns the developments of the war in Syria and its implications on the Israeli border and security status. Ibrahim also holds lectures discussing the challenges of the Arab minority within Israel, as well as groups from abroad, ranging from students to journalists and diplomats. Ibrahim holds a BA in international relations, which when he got that degree, he focused on US Middle Eastern relations. He started his degree in the American University in Cairo, Egypt, but after the Arab Spring started, he moved to the US and he completed his degree at James Madison University in Virginia. I'm excited. This is going to be great, guys. We want you to ask questions during the event. So if you have something to say, use the raise hand function, which you guys should have on your screen, I believe. So if when I notice that you guys have a question, I'll jump in if you don't mind, Ibrahim, and I'll tell people with questions to go ahead and speak, and they can unmute themselves, and we can get a dialogue going. So without further ado, here is Ibrahim.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Zach. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Just one tiny thing. I will give in between every little phase of the lecture, I will ask if anyone has questions so far, because it is important to me that everybody will understand, all the topic that we're talking about, and all these things are all synchronized. So if we're missing on one thing, you might miss the rest of the lecture. So I will stop during the discussion itself, and I'll give everybody an opportunity to ask questions. Just also bear in mind that if you have any rhetorical questions or questions that are not for understanding the topic, you can also wait for the end, because we're going to have a Q&A at the end. But if there's anything that you want to ask, and if there's anything unclear, I don't mind stopping. We will stop throughout the lecture, and we're going to discuss everything that you want as well. So like what Zad said, my name is Ibrahim. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Personally, it's my personal life mission to discuss the topics concerning our minority as an Arab minority here in Israel. And as Zach said, I've studied in the US in James Madison. So I do understand a little bit from the difficulties that you might face in on-campus events, challenges, and try to bring an understanding of where we are standing as citizens of Israel in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how to discuss the conflict as well. So in general, if anyone has a question regarding that at the end, it'll be my pleasure to have an open discussion concerning that topic. I can tell you on a personal level, as a citizen of the country and as someone who's part of the Arab minority, for those who are not familiar with who we are 20% of the population here in Israel. Arab-speaking population, and we are divided into about 18% Muslim and about 2% Christians. We're about 1.5 million citizens. What distinguishes us as a minority, bear in mind that we're not the only minority in Israel. There are other minorities, and I don't want to give the understanding that all the minorities are the same, because our particular minority as the Arab citizens of Israel, we have a very specific definition with that we are Arab speakers and we are part of either the Muslim or the Christian religions. That particular distinction is because of the fact that we do not have conscription at the age of 18. As you're might be familiar, most Israelis have to serve in the IDF. The Arab minority in Israel does not. But there are other minorities such as the Druze minority, not Jews, Druze, D-R-U-Z-E minority, which is an ethnic and religious minority here in Israel that does serve in the IDF at the age of 18. And we are excluded from that conscription. Among other stuff that I won't get all the way into it, I can tell you on a personal level that my identity as Ibrahim, I definitely see myself as an Israeli citizen as well as a Palestinian at the same time. I do believe in accepting our complexity, and we are both. I mean, we are Arab minority, Arab-speaking minority with cultural heritage and delicious food that it's part of the culture and norm, which is a Palestinian norm. In the same time, we were born, raised as Israelis in this country as citizens, and we wouldn't have been the same people if we were born and raised in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, or definitely as refugees anywhere else as a diaspora. So we are accumulation of those two identities within us. Within our community, there is an identity crisis. I mean, in general, people clash between what are we? Are we Israelis? Are we Palestinians? Are we somewhere in the middle? My personal answer is to embrace all, and we are accumulation of all these different identities. And this is who we are. We should make the best of all of it. But the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as Zach mentioned before, is the hottest topic on campuses, and people discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict all the time. But sometimes one of the things that people forget or do not realize is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in terms of Israel is not Israel's most existential threat. Not at the moment, it's not. Israel's existential threat comes from our northern borders. And when I say the northern borders, I'm talking about the borders with Lebanon and with Syria. Today, we're going to focus on the border with Lebanon, and particularly the effect of Hezbollah on the border. One sec. Can anybody see my Sarias?
Yep, I believe we can see it now.
Okay, perfect. Our research center focuses on Israel's security challenges along the northern borders, which is what we're talking right now. We are located about 7 miles from the border with Lebanon, or 11 kilometers, and about 34 miles or 55 kilometers with the border with Syria. This particular day, I'm really glad that we ended up having this conversation today, because yesterday on October 17th, we celebrated, or we're commemorating 1 year into the uprising that started in Lebanon on the 17th of October, 2019. It was really coincidental, but at the end, we ended up discussing the topic literally about a year later. The issue of Lebanon came into the media, and particularly the world media, in the past couple of months, definitely because of the explosion that happened in August 4th of this year in Beirut. If you're not familiar with the explosion, you can see it on the screen behind me. And this is the thing that brought the attention of the world to what's going on in Lebanon. The explosion in Beirut left about between 100 and 200,000 people without homes. We had people who are friends of ours, who are researchers, and people who work in humanitarian projects in Lebanon about 4 days after the explosion. And they've told us that houses, even the bases of the houses, are all a mess. They do not understand how people are still living in these houses. The fact that the explosion was going towards the sea was just a lucky coincidence. If the explosion was going towards the city, we might have had an even worse explosion that we had on October 4th. What happened in the explosion? The explosion, as I said, it's not the problem, but it kind of showed us and gave exemplified and intensified the problem of Lebanon. And the poster that you can see on the screen is definitely something that highlights this issue the most. The Lebanese youth who are looking for a liberal a country that is a democratic one are looking for help. And as the slogan is saying right here, that they feel that they are hostages of the Iran and its militia in the country, Hezbollah. The country in Lebanon, the problems with Lebanon did not start, as I said, with the explosion in Beirut, and actually it did not even start with Hezbollah. The problems in Lebanon itself are embedded all the way from the establishment of the country. The country itself is divided on sectarian level. Between 1975 all the way till 1990, for 15 years, Lebanon suffered from a civil war. The civil war was a clash between Muslim Sunni groups, Muslim Shia groups, different militias of Christian groups, and Druze, accompanied by Palestinian terrorist groups that were in Lebanon at a time. And the civil war lasted for 15 years that resulted in a peace agreement in 1990 and a division of power. That division of power, in order not to have clash between all these sectarian groups within the country, the agreement was that each position needs to be held by one part of the country, which means that, as you can see in the image, the president of Lebanon will always be a Maronite Christian. Particularly Maronite, it's because the Maronite Christians are the largest Christian group in Lebanon. The Lebanese prime minister, who we don't have one at the moment, will always be a Sunni Muslim, while the speaker of the parliament will always be a Shiite Muslim. And the head of the military will always be a Druze. This division of power was meant not to have clashes between all the different groups. The feeling during the civil war that the war over Lebanon was who is the strongest religious group in the country and who's going to dominate and control it. And the division of power was supposed to solve that issue. One of the biggest problems with this division of power was, one of them was Hezbollah. Hezbollah, as a terrorist group, used its ability to not only be a terrorist group with a military, which we like to call an army, a second army within a state, and they create a state within a state. They also have a social wing and a political wing. They have their own political party that in their eyes is disentangled from the military one. And that's the image that they present also to the world. And this is part of the the clash that Israel is having with the world to try to understand that Hezbollah, of all its wings, is one entity, while some, particularly European countries, view all these different wings as separate. For instance, if Hezbollah is doing social work and activities for the people inside of Lebanon, that is encouraged and it's supported, but not its military wing. The only thing that we are missing is the fact that Hezbollah uses the civil wings and uses activities and sports and social activities among the civilian population in order to convince people to join the military wing. Hezbollah, using the political party under its control, was able to also be part of the Lebanese government. And because the Shiite population, which Hezbollah is a Shiite, they are Shiite Muslims, because the Shiites have their own dedicated position within the country, they are always guaranteed a seat in the government, no matter what. And this is what sustained their power and also even strengthened their power in the past few years. Unfortunately, after the second Lebanon war between Israel and Lebanon in 2006, the situation in Lebanon actually did deteriorate politically. Hezbollah took a stronger position in the country. The corruption that started even before the war, after the 2005 assassination of their prime minister by Hezbollah members, the corruption increased. The political, we can see a political instability increasing in the country, as well as economic decline up to a collapse. In 2018, we had elections in Lebanon that were on May 2018. And actually, it took all the way till January 2019 to form a government. All the way till January 2019 to form a government. That government did not last too long. The problems within the country were the same for the past 10 years, 20 years. The economic decline kept, the economy kept sinking, and there was no end in sight. One thing that the government tried to do, try to form a clever scheme to get revenue for the government, was on October 2019, exactly a year ago, the government tried to impose a tax on WhatsApp, which basically taxed WhatsApp calls. If anybody uses the app WhatsApp, it's very common in the Middle East. I know it's less so in the US, but WhatsApp calls are for free. And the government tried to tax it in order to get extra revenues from the civilians. And the people saw it as a cheap way in order for the country to try to figure out and solve their economic problems, because the problems are within the politicians themselves and the corruption they have instated on this country for more than 10 years. Due to that WhatsApp, a very simple act by the government to do a tax on WhatsApp calls, a whole protest came out on October 17, like I said, a year ago in Lebanon. And as you can see in the video right here, this is the protest that was led by the youth in Lebanon, and it kind of resembles the Arab Spring that we saw in the beginning of the 2011 and 12 in Syria, in Egypt, in Tunisia, and in other countries in the Arab world. One thing that kind of highlighted this protest was the fact that the people were tired of the sectarian divide. The sectarian divide only increased the corruption in the country. And if you see the video right here, we can see an imam and a priest and a Shiite imam as well, all holding hands together and asking for the removal of sectarianism of the country and embracing the fact that everyone is a Lebanese citizen and everyone is one, and we should not be divided into any religious divisions. Are there any questions for now before we continue? Okay. The other highlight of the protests, other than the sectarian issue, was the fact that it was the first time that we can see in the protests people calling for the government to resign. And not only that the government should resign, because at a time, as I said, Hezbollah is part of the government, and the chants on the streets in this video right here were calling, everyone means everyone. Hezbollah is part of that. It was the first time that Hezbollah's name was mentioned in specific. It was not criticism of Hezbollah as a terrorist group, but it was a first step. It was saying that Hezbollah is not immune to criticism, something that Hezbollah enjoyed for too long. It was immune to criticism, and people were scared to criticize Hezbollah in public. But here we saw people calling for the dismantle of the government, and yes, Hezbollah is part of that government that needs to be dismantled. January 2020, after the protests went viral, the government collapsed and resigned. We had new government formed in January of this year, and actually it did exactly the opposite of what the protesters wanted. The first thing that this government did was continue the division, the sectarian division, and the second thing was, despite the fact that the prime minister is always Sunni Muslim, he was a pro-Hezbollah. One of the things that Hezbollah was able to exploit is the fact that you do not need to be a Shiite to strengthen the position of Hezbollah in the country. The prime minister, who's Sunni, was very much a supporter of Hezbollah. And the president, Michel Aoun, a Christian president, as I said, is always Christian, and he's been the president for the past 15 years. He also is an ally of Hezbollah. So Hezbollah, after the elections, actually strengthened its position. It had about 30% support in the previous government, but in the formation of the government in January 2020, it was around 90% of the parliament was supportive of Hezbollah. So this actually strengthened the position of Hezbollah for the next 8 months. It all stopped. All this support for Hezbollah stopped on one day in the blast in Beirut in August 4th, 2020. The explosion showed the position and the threat that Hezbollah imposes to Beirut and to the Lebanese people. The fact that Hezbollah works as a second army, unchecked, uncontrolled, is influencing the Lebanese public. And that's the first time that the Lebanese public were actually were able to see the full impact of what it means to have a second army that can threaten your own people. Hezbollah always viewed itself as the protector of Lebanon, and it was doing so really well. In 2014, if we remember the age of ISIS, ISIS almost reached into Lebanon. And at that time, the first people who stood against ISIS on the border were Hezbollah, even before the Lebanese army. And the notion continued to strengthen that Hezbollah is the protector of this country, not only against Israel as it always says it is, but also against ISIS, and it protected them from ISIS. But these images started to shatter when we saw the explosion and the fact that Hezbollah is holding missiles inside civilian populated area. And also we had another explosion which was not as publicized. In September, last month, a month after the explosion in Beirut, we had another explosion in south of Lebanon in another weapons storage inside a civilian populated area. After this explosion, there was an increase in the protests against Hezbollah, and we saw something that we did not see in the first wave of protests of October, what we call the WhatsApp protest. In this protest, people started chanting, and in this video right here, in the middle of Beirut, Irhabi, Irhabi, Hezbollah, Irhabi. Terrorist, terrorist, Hezbollah is terrorist. It was never called in public in the middle of Beirut by the Lebanese people as a terrorist organization as the way it was after the explosion. More than that, it was the first time that we could see in the picture right here an image of Nasrallah hanging. And this was a shocking image for Hezbollah, who always viewed itself as the strongest and the strongest entity in Lebanon. But now we can see a change, a small little change in the people's perspective of the country towards Hezbollah. And after that, in the past couple weeks, we're seeing also a change in the perspective towards Israel. But let me ask you this. What do you think Hezbollah did when we had all these protests against it in October and right now? A couple of weeks before the explosion in Beirut, one of the things that we saw was an alleged attack by Israel in Syria, and it actually killed a Hezbollah operative in Syria. What Hezbollah did was try to shift the focus from the explosion in Beirut, and literally 4 days after I think 2 days after the explosion, Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, came on television and said he does not know where the explosion comes from, and if it is Israel, Israel will pay, and that also Israel should not forget that Hezbollah still has an open bill over the death of one of its soldiers in Syria. With that, what Nasrallah is trying to do is shift the focus from the explosion, from the damage that he and Hezbollah caused to the Lebanese people, and try to say that our focus should be on our mutual enemy, Israel. In the first protest, actually in October, when people called for the dismantle of the government, we could see something that you might also relate with, because what Hezbollah did to shift the focus was also putting flags of Israel, the small Satan as he calls it, and the US, the large Satan, on the streets. And if you can see the video right here, and have people just drive on their cars, stepping on the flags, and having people standing on top of it, taking pictures, again, to shift the focus and say that these are our enemies and not Hezbollah. The explosion, as I said, this did not help. The explosion itself was way too strong for the people to forget. And what we're seeing in the past couple of weeks is actually a change. Because for the first time, some of you might have heard, Israel and Lebanon are going to start a new discussion over the disputed maritime border. It must be emphasized that between Lebanon and Israel, we don't call it a border, because the border is something that the two countries agree on. And there is a disagreement between Israel and Lebanon over the border. In terms of the terrestrial border, Israel agrees along all the line that was approved by the UN after it withdrew from Lebanon in the year 2000. But Lebanon, particularly Hezbollah, holds a position that there are 7 points on the border that should be Lebanese territories, that right now are within the Israeli part of the border. And these are the disputes in terms of terrestrial. In terms of the maritime border that we're discussing today, the dispute comes because of international law, because of a loophole in international law, a gap in international law. What international law states in terms of maritime border between two countries is that the border can be set in two different ways. One, it's either you measure it at 90 degrees angle at the point where the border starts between the two countries, or it continues on a straight line the way that the way that the land ends towards the border. And the problem between Lebanon and Israel is that each state took the law that will help it increase its position more than the other. So we have kind of like a gap in the middle that you can see in the disputed area. Ended up being Israel wants the line on the top, Lebanon wants the line at the bottom, and now we have a whole gap in the middle. There is a disputed area. Why are we discussing this border at the moment? One of the things is the fact that Lebanon has been trying to pump gas from the Mediterranean, and it already signed contracts with French, German, Italian companies to try to get gas out of the Mediterranean, something that Israel has been doing in the past few years. But some of the rich areas are located in the disputed area, and also a lot of these companies are not willing to work while there is a dispute over the maritime border and the location where they can try to extract gas. And particularly when Lebanon is suffering from such a huge economic collapse and needing billions of dollars in order to reconstruct Beirut literally from the ashes, it needs revenue and quick. So now we can see Lebanon leaning more towards negotiation with Israel. On that notion, there's actually disagreements between, is this kind of negotiation good for Israel or not? On the one hand, we can see that the benefit from starting negotiation with Lebanon. We can even see that some journalists within Lebanon are calling for not only solving the issue of the maritime border, but solving the issues of the terrestrial border. And some people in Israel right now are dreaming of a peace treaty with Lebanon. And that's all because of Hezbollah's position and the tough position it's in at the moment. But in the same time, the problem with a deal like that is the fact that, one, it is not reliant on the terrestrial border, which means that we can solve the maritime border, but continue having problems on the terrestrial border. And two, Hezbollah is still part of the government. And if Hezbollah continues to be part of the government, where are all these revenues from the gas going towards? Is it actually going towards the reconstruction of Beirut? Can we check where are these reconstructions going to? Or can Hezbollah use its position, use its power, and receive revenue out of the gas extraction that should go to the Lebanese people and take it for itself? And this is the debate, and this is actually an open question. In any case, I mean, we are always looking for a peace treaty over no treaty, or a negotiation over no negotiations. But these negotiations also need to be checked. Where is this deal going to, and who's going to actually benefit from it? Because if Hezbollah ends up being the only beneficiary out of this deal, that also can be a danger in terms of the Israeli north and in Israel in general. I will end with one last thing that I would love to share with you, which is a video of Nasrallah And this is something that some people do not understand in terms of the threats that are imposed on the northern borders. And we are residents of the north, and I can tell you that this is part of our threat that can also affect us as well. Here, Nasrallah on the map shows what's occupied Palestine, and he clearly states all the infrastructure, government buildings, malls, the seaports, the Ben Gurion airport, all the electricity companies, all these are highlighted on a map, a target map that he's threatening to use in order to attack in future. I will end with this. And if anyone has any questions.
Ibrahim, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I think very enlightening for all of us to learn about what's going on beyond Israel's borders, because as we already discussed, we talk a lot about the area between the river and the sea, and that's all fine and good, but there's also much more going on if we expand outward too, and it's important to talk about. And you clearly know your stuff. That was fantastic. So thank you. That was great. I believe we have about 10 minutes or so for questions. Looks like we already have a couple people with hands raised. So Sarah, why don't we start with you? Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm from the George Washington University. And first of all, thank you so much for coming. I found this to be really enlightening because really I've heard about Syria, I've heard about Jordan, I've heard about, kind of all of those other places, but I really never hear about Lebanon. And I kind of had two questions that are kind of connected. So the first one is, how does Hamas kind of play into this whole situation? Does Hezbollah and Hamas have that kind of strong relationship that they may use with each other? Unfortunately, against Israel, but do they have that kind of relationship? And also the other question I had is, with the peace deals that have just happened with the United States and the UAE and Bahrain, do you find that it could potentially put pressure on Lebanon, or even, now that people are really upset with the Lebanese government, does it put any kind of pressure on them to start these deals?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. To the first question that you had, yes, there is definitely connection between Hezbollah and Hamas. One of the things that we talk about is the fact that there is like a Sunni versus Shiite clash in the Middle East. But these kind of, it's not, black or white, because in the Middle East, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And Hezbollah and Hamas, even though Hamas is a Sunni organization, Sunni Palestinian organization, and Hezbollah is a Shiite organization, they are both enemies of Israel. We have seen in the past few years, and particularly actually in the past couple years, a lot of visits from hierarchy of Hamas in Lebanon with high members of Hezbollah. And the connection is definitely there. And here, kind of the Shiite Sunni division kind of collapses because there is a mutual enemy at stake. And that's one of the threats. That's one of the things that we also ask as a question. If we have a war in the north, what kind of a war would that be? Will it be just with Lebanon? It doesn't appear to be the case. Because one, Hezbollah is not only in Lebanon. Today, Hezbollah is also existing in Syria. Hezbollah has exploited the civil war in Syria, and it's actually positioning itself as close as possible to the border on the Golan Heights. And it has already established military bases throughout the Syrian side of the Golan. So the question is, if we have a war, it could be potentially part of Hezbollah from Lebanon, the other part coming from Syria, and the support of Hamas from the Gaza Strip, which will be a war on 3 different borders all at once. And that's the biggest threat that we're facing at the moment. I didn't have enough time to go into Hezbollah inside Syria, but it was a great time to just put it out there. And thank you so much for your question. I hope it answered it.
Well, thank you, Ibrahim. I think we have another question coming in from Ori. If you want to unmute yourself, go ahead, Ori.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ori. I'm from Hebrew U in Jerusalem, Israel. Thank you so much for coming. It's very interesting. Do you know how many people was in the protest against Nasrallah and Hezbollah?
The specific protest against him? Honestly, in
Biggest
terms of
protest against him, how many people was?
It was in the thousands. There aren't any real estimates in terms of numbers. One of the things that we lack in Lebanon and the Middle East in general is accurate data. But there were thousands on the streets, definitely hundreds at least, calling by name saying terrorists, Hezbollah is terrorists. That was at least hundreds. And in the protests where we saw the picture of Nasrallah hanging, there were thousands in that, like one of the largest squares in Beirut. And it went unopposed, and people let that hang. So what is the number? No one can say, but the numbers are rising. I hope that answers the question.
Wow, it's amazing revolution. Thank you.
Slowly but steady.
Yeah, absolutely. Very dynamic region, always developments happening. So yeah, paying attention to it is definitely fascinating and definitely a good move for everyone to take part in. All right, let's see here. We have another question. We have like 5 more minutes or so we can probably get a couple more questions. Austin, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Zach. Thank you so much, Ibrahim, for talking. My name's Austin. I go to Carleton University here in Ottawa, Canada. My question, which was kind of already answered about the diplomatic pressures from other states that are becoming peaceful with Israel, do you think that it is solely Hezbollah that's kind of in the way of making peace with Israel because they are a terrorist organization, or do you think it's a mixture of Hezbollah, the culture, and just the entrenched belief that Israel is some evil monolith? Or is it solely just Hezbollah as a whole that is stopping peace?
Excellent question, actually. Definitely Hezbollah is the biggest obstacle because Hezbollah is adamantly against any kind of negotiation or any discussion of the topic. So, I mean, Lebanon itself is not all Hezbollah, and not everybody who has problems with Israel is also supportive of Hezbollah, but that also kind of blends in together. The second Lebanese war happened in 2006. 2006 wasn't too long ago. And some people in South Lebanon, whether or not they're supporters of Hezbollah, they were inflicted by the war. And even if you're not supportive of Hezbollah, some people might have perspective against Israel that is one that views Israel as an enemy, regardless of Hezbollah. But that's the way it is in other countries throughout the Middle East. I lived in Egypt, and I can tell you from a personal experience, Egypt is a country that has a peace treaty with Israel since the 70s. And a large portion of the Egyptian population, at least the one I encountered in Cairo, definitely the younger generation, were very much anti-Israel. They don't have Hezbollah, they don't have a terrorist organization, but they're very much anti-Israel. That can change culturally. And we see that because with UAE, the peace treaty is not just a diplomatic treaty between two states. It's looking to shape as a peace treaty also between people, because the people in the UAE and Bahrain are also starting to embrace a peace between the nations, looking to come to Jerusalem and pray in Al-Aqsa, and there are things that they are also interested in. Definitely aside from also security issues and want to have an alliance with a strong state as Israel is against a common enemy, which is Iran. But there is a cultural aspect into it. That was not the case with Egypt, and it wasn't the case with Jordan, where more than half of the population is Palestinian, but we have effectively peace treaties with these countries. So at least on a basic level, we can potentially reach a negotiation even with the population not being totally on board, but it needs to come also from the bottom up, because if not, we're just going to have another Egypt and Jordan. And that's not the kind of peace that we were hoping for. We wish for a better peace. I hope that answered the question.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. And I think we have time for one more question before we have some closing remarks. I just want to say, just for me personally, thank you, Ibrahim, for being here and chatting with us about this. Your research is extremely important. It's fascinating. I've read up on it a bit just to prepare for this webinar, and it's great stuff. I appreciate everything that you're doing, and I think I speak for everybody here when I say that. So yeah, it was great to have you with us today. Okay, and we have just one more minute left, so we'll try to fit in one last question. I saw earlier there was a hand raised from Michal. If you want to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi everyone. My name is Michal. I'm from the Hebrew U from Jerusalem, Israel. And I was curious how the population in Lebanon, how weren't they afraid to go against Nasrallah? Was it only for the explosion, or because I believe Hezbollah uses force? And how come there were very many demonstrations against him just now? You know, how didn't they afraid from him?
The answer is that they're always afraid. Hezbollah is always it always uses intimidation in terms of preventing criticism within Lebanon. That has always been the case and will continue to be the case. But the first protests in October with the WhatsApp, they included Hezbollah just as part of the problem. It's not saying Hezbollah is terrorists, or not saying, as a political party, you are part of the problem. The whole government is problematic and you are part of the government. Don't think we don't know that. And that was just the first step in order to start being able to criticize Hezbollah. But after the explosion, that was just one step too many. Even though no one really knows what happened in the explosion, everyone in Lebanon and everyone who's like researches Lebanon is aware of the fact that Hezbollah is the one that dominates the port. Everything that goes in and out, everything that is stored in it, is Hezbollah would know about. So first and foremost, the first one to blame for the explosion is Hezbollah. And for that, people were started to feel brave enough to stand in the street and say, this is your fault, and you are threatening the civilian population. And actually now people are even looking more and more towards to try to find if there are other places that might have weapons that might explode. And literally a month later, another small building exploded in South Lebanon, and it wasn't even that publicized. But these things are starting, and it's not easy. Definitely not easy when a terrorist group is dominating the country. But unfortunately, I'm saying, definitely unfortunately, we needed to wait for a catastrophe like this to happen before people were able to raise their voice. But if one thing we can take out of this catastrophe is that people are starting to voice their opinion. I hope that answers the question, Michal.
Yeah, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
All right, I'll jump in here. Thank you again, Ibrahim, for taking the time today to speak with us all. And thank you, Zach, for moderating both the conversations. But most importantly, thank you to all of our wonderful camera fellows. You guys have just been killing it this year. So thank you for making the time to be here today. One last thing before I let you all go and enjoy the rest of your Sundays. As you know, we have our Mizrahi Stories campaign launching November 1st, so for the entire month. Your co-camera fellows, Jordana, Avital, and Ellie, have been working really hard to make this campaign meaningful and
visually beautiful one. You'll really enjoy some of the material that they've made. So we'll be sending out promotional material early this week with a link to sign up for the campaign. It's important to note that the campaign is open to everyone, so you don't have to be a camera student or even a student at all to participate. And we're just really excited to be able to provide you guys with the social media materials, resources, articles, event ideas, and much more for anyone who would like to participate. And I know quite a few of you are already drafting your first articles to go alongside the campaign, and that some of you are even planning to host speakers to talk about important issues involving different Mizrahi communities. So we're pretty excited about November. It's going to be a great month. Otherwise, I hope you had a wonderful rest of your, or I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend, and we'll see you soon. Thank you so much again.